Welcome to Season 4 of Grieving Common. You're listening to different voices from the Winston Swish youth team.
We're a group of grieving young people who are helping to shape the future of grief support.
We're all different, but we've all got grief in common. If you are aged 13 or over, this podcast is suitable for you.
Winston Swish is a charity that supports children and young people who are bereaved or facing the death of someone important to them. And this podcast is our space to talk honestly about what that feels like.
We'll be sharing our ideas, experiences and conversations that we hope will help you feel less alone. If you'd like to help us keep this going, you can donate at winstonswish.org. Thank you.
In this episode of Grief in Common, we mention cancer and brain tumours, and we talk about death and grief throughout.
Hello, welcome back to Grief in Common. My name is Jake. I'm 23 years old. I'm from a little place called Bognor Regis. I joined the youth team to hopefully kind of break stigmas and, sort of put the awareness out there of sort of young men and things like that who have gone through a traumatic experience and how it can affect people. And I'm here with Ben. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hiya, so I'm Ben. I'm a student studying in Winchester. I'm 22 years old and I joined the youth team because I'm really interested in using what I study as a degree, which is philosophy, to help people deal with death and dying in a way that's really helpful to them. Yeah, that's kind of the motivator behind it. And I find that people who are part of the youth team and people who do things like this podcast are of a similar mindset. They also want to turn something, like you say, that's traumatic into something that hopefully brings about some sort of hope or positivity to some people. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why I really wanted to jump on this podcast. As much as I have never done anything like this before and I feel very uncomfortable, I've never actually spoken to anyone who's my age who's gone through something similar. I think it would be not just interesting for other people. I think it's quite interesting for me as well to sort of know that perhaps what I was going through is, was normal, and the way I sort of dealt with it, and perhaps the stigmas that I went through. It's nice to know that it wasn't just me, and for other people watching this as well. I think it's important for them to know that they're not alone, I think, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest revelations for me, having joined the youth team, was at an in-person day when I met so many other people who'd been through similar things to me, and it was such a cathartic feeling of like, oh my gosh, there's actually people here who have gone through similar things to me. I'm not, the kid whose mum died at school age. There's definitely a kind of stigma, a feeling that existed at the time. So yeah, I really hope things like this podcast are a great way to reach out to people who, need to feel that there is a normativity to it. Not that it's a normal thing to happen, but that it's it's less not normal, if that makes any sense.
It does. I think it's important because I think for myself personally, I found it quite easy to sort of always go and just think sort of, why me? Because I'd never met anyone in a similar boat, I suppose. So, I've only started with the youth team about 3 months ago as well. I've not actually done any in-person stuff. But yeah, I think it's important to realise and see other people's sort of point of view from it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I guess on kind of that note, and in terms of milestones that we're kind of covering and talking about, I think that is definitely a milestone that you can identify, is that initial feeling of, oh, it's not just me kind of thing. It's a real, for me, it's a kind of turnaround in thought in that way, when you realise that I think part of grieving is initially that feeling of complete isolation. Like,
100%. Yeah.
Why did it happen to me? What did I do so wrong that made me kind of suffer this? And then you realize eventually that it's much more normative experience, and it's a breakdown in that thought process, and it's a real moment that I identified, at least, of, I don't know what to call it, but healing is probably the closest word I can use.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I suppose if you don't mind me asking, I guess how did it all start with you?
Yeah, so to summarize it loosely, my mother had cancer for about a process of 5 years. When I was 13, I found out 2 weeks before she passed away that the whole time I had just thought she was ill. She actually had a life-threatening illness, and a terminal illness. And then 2 weeks following learning all of that was the time that she died. So that was definitely a real process of, reshaping me in that way. I think in terms of grief, the most important thing for me is that I was in such denial for a really long time in a way that I didn't realize. Everyone expected me for, when I was 13, 14, 15, like, oh, he's going to be grieving. This is a horrible thing. He's going to be suffering it. And then you get to kind of college, and because you've transferred from a school that you were in to somewhere different, there's this real expectation that, okay, well, you've left right behind now. But in actuality, that was when it hit me, was kind of going through that complete change and then going, oh, that thing happened to me, and that's now all hitting me at once, and I don't know what to do about it, and it doesn't feel like the support's there in the same way. So it was a really different process. Yeah. I mean, what about yourself? How did?
I mean, all that you've just said, then I can really relate to. But I'll get onto that. So yeah, when I was 10, one day, I'll just briefly summarize it all. But I went to the cinema it was supposed to be a family day out. And my dad was feeling a bit ill. He had a headache. He used to get them regularly. And we thought it was just because he didn't wear his glasses as much as he should do. And then towards the end of the film, my mum was trying to call him just to check up, and the phone wasn't answering, and we had remember the anxiety and sort of dread driving home. We were sort of told my little sister and I were told to wait downstairs whilst my mum went up to check on him. And while she went up, I snuck up behind her and sort of peered through the banister. My dad was lying there, and it turns out he had a brain tumour that no one was aware of. So the next day, at very early hours of the morning, he passed away. There was nothing they could do. It was too late. So yeah, it happened all very suddenly. And I was 10, so this happened when I was in junior school. So I was in year 5, and I was a bit of I didn't really fit in at school. And then when this event happened, I did have all these people, and even like kids that used to bully me at school, all of a sudden coming up to me and being like nice to me. It was odd. And I mean, also at that age, I wasn't really able to process what had happened. I felt very numb. I mean, there was the odd time where I would, cry, but most of the time I just felt very numb and nothing's quite seemed real. And then, yeah, like you were saying about college, when I left to go into junior school, into secondary school, there was that whole pressure of like, I knew that no one there was kind of aware of my situation, and I didn't think anyone would sort of care, and I didn't really know how I'd sort of go about it. So I tried to just sort of, blend in with everyone else and, make friends. And it was really hard. Like, it felt like everyone around me was moving on, and then I had this thing, this grief that was dragging me back, and I wasn't actually really that aware of it. But yeah, I don't know whether your experience with college was kind of like that as well, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was a college sixth form, so it was a transition from the secondary school I had been at to, the same place but a different building, essentially.
Yeah.
What was really strange was like the change in attitude. So
Mm-hmm.
all the teachers who knew my situation, had known me for years, besides a few new ones and stuff, they all seemed to like be recast in some way. It was like I'd gone from being secondary school Ben to being college Ben. So
Yeah.
it was definitely, like you said, it's odd. It was very, very odd more than anything. The way that they sort of responded to it as if it was something that had now gone away, as if it was a different version of me and therefore they could deal with it differently in that way. And I also think, like what you were saying, I didn't typically fit in anyways throughout like my entire schooling experience. I in primary school was like really battling with ADHD. That was a nightmare in many ways. Didn't like have many friends, that kind of things. And then went into secondary school, that kind of calmed down. Then this all kind of happened, and it put me as that kind of outsider again in that way. It felt like I'd gone into secondary school, found a community that I fit into, and then that was entirely kind of stripped away from me through
Yeah.
everybody else exists in one way and I exist in a different way. And how do I therefore manage that? And for years and years and years, I think it was almost like just experimenting with how do I fit in? What am I? Who am I? And it's only, now 3 years into university that I actually think I'm getting some sense of who I am in that way. Even
Yeah.
so it's such a long process, and that's why I find the attitude that you go through these different milestones or these different points in life and you're just expected to like get over it at a finite point is really, really weird. And I wonder where that attitude comes from in some ways. I don't understand how that's been manufactured.
You said that there wasn't that kind of support at college. That I felt the exact same at school. And yeah, like I said, I always struggled to sort of fit in anyway. And then I had that pressure of trying, I was worried about bullies and things like that going into secondary school. I had all that pressure anyway, and then the added pressure of, like, I wanted everyone to know my situation, but at the same time, I didn't. And, some of my former classmates who went up to that secondary school as well, all that sort of sympathy I had at junior school was completely, that vanished very quickly. And then that whole pressure of moving on increased with every year that passed, kind of thing. I progressively got worse in terms of like my behavior and things like that, because I never spoke about what happened. Obviously at the age of 10, I wasn't really able to process it. But then when I kind of became perhaps a little bit aware of it, sort of midway through secondary school, so maybe like year 9, so maybe I was like 13, 14, I felt because so much time had passed, that grief I experienced was much more irrelevant and harder to speak about, because I felt like, well, I should have moved on by now and I shouldn't really be thinking about it. And then that's when things developed. Like I started to become like a class clown and attention seeking ways, and I did stupid things to try and make friends, like I was a shy kid, I think, but I was always doing like stupid things and misbehaving to get attention. And I think that was really just another form of my suppressed grief, wanting to be sort of viewed, I think. Yeah, I don't know if you can relate to any of that, I suppose.
Absolutely. I think I also wasn't, I don't know, I was never naughty in that way. I didn't like, hurt people, bully other people. It was never that kind of behavioural issue, but it was, like you say, it was the class clown kind of attitude. It was like,
Yeah.
I'm the one who's going to do all the stupid stuff that's going to make everybody laugh. And it's like you say, it feels like you're trying to establish an identity kind of thing.
Yeah.
I also completely agree. I think it's trying to exercise that grief in some way. It's trying to, because you want everybody to know, you want everybody to see you for what you are, but you can't just go up to people and be like, "Hey, my mum's dead." Like, that's not.
Yeah, exactly.
But you want to kind of scream it from the rooftops and be like, "Yeah, this is me. This is what I've been through, and I'm struggling. So somebody help me," kind of thing.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's really hard. So I think I definitely identify with that feeling of like different kind of behavior. And I think it raises a whole separate issue off the back of that, which is that I think a lot of the times people perceive grief in a very binary way, as though it's something where somebody is sad, where they are, crying a lot, where they're a little bit miserable, they're a bit depressed. But nobody seems to imagine that part of grieving is potentially laughing a lot, joking a lot, reckless kind of behavior, anger as well. Like, that's something that I personally didn't experience, but I know is such a huge experience of so many people. And it feels a lot like what people want when you're grieving is an almost tidy grief, like, that they can deal with. Like, if you're sad, this is okay, you can grieve in that way, but you can't be angry, you can't be naughty, you can't do these. There's like a set behavior that you're allowed to experience.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
It does. I think a lot of people think there's kind of a set process with grieving. And the reality is it just jumps around all the time. I mean, it's been, I think, 13 years? I'm 23 now, so yeah, 13 years since my dad passed. And although they're not as extreme, the emotions and things that I get now, they still happen. There are still random times where something might trigger me. Sometimes I'll do that stupid, maybe class clown thing, but in a different form. It bounces around all the time. It's not something that is a set process, and everyone's different as well. And yeah, it took a very long time for me to realize that, a really long time. And like you said as well, there were so many times in secondary school and as a kid where I'd be in my room and I'd just be in this sort of hole of depression, and I wanted people to witness me right then being that low. And because I didn't know how to sort of express that then developed quite quickly into anger and things like that. And then that anger went from not just being in my room, it happened in school and outside school. And I got in trouble with the police and things like that because I just didn't know how to control my emotions. I didn't know. I basically just wasn't witnessing my own grief. It was just crying out to be witnessed, and I wasn't doing that. And I think there was definitely that lack of support, I suppose, at school. Like, we did have a counsellor there, but the thing is I feel like you have to be ready to speak about that kind of thing. And going to a counsellor who's at school as well. I mean, a lot of the worry for me was I didn't even want to see. I didn't want people to see me walk into that area where the counsellor was, because I feel like people would ask questions or they'd know why I'd gone in there. There was almost kind of that thing like I wanted like when a teacher like reads out a register, I sort of maybe wanted something to be next to my name. It was like a marker that I'd been through something. So like if I was perhaps acting up a little bit in class, they might have been like come up to me in private and been like, "Oh, do you want some breathing space?" or something like that. But what usually always ended up happening was I just had friction with a lot of my teachers because they didn't really understand why I was perhaps acting like I was. And don't get me wrong, I was a pain a lot of the time. I understand that, but yeah, a lot of it was just because I didn't know how to deal with it. So yeah, I did struggle a lot with that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And the whole school counselling idea is really interesting. It's I don't know, I see it as a kind of, they're doing something rather than nothing, which is good.
Yeah.
But it's not a great model for help, because I always found that it's like you get called into a room at a random point in the day and you're there and they're like, "How are you doing?" and expect you just to kind of pour your heart out. And it's like, as I'm not gonna do that, because I'm just, wanting to go to lunch and laugh and joke with my friends because I'm at school. You've pulled me out of an English class. So it was a very strange experience. And, the counsellor I had, she was lovely and she continued to help for as long as she could. Did the utmost for me, but it was also like I never properly got to the bottom of things with her until it was like too late, mental health wise, or something had happened behaviorally, and then she'd be like, "I know why you did this. I'm not stupid. I know you're struggling." But for me, it's like nobody's stepping in beforehand. Nobody's seeing it like that. They just see you as you're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And it's really hard. It's really, really hard, because you can understand they see you as you're just being annoying. You're just being, one of the bad kids. And it's like, no, I'm not being one of the bad kids. I'm struggling, but I'm struggling in a way that you can't see as easily. And it's not necessarily their fault, but you want them to, like you say, you almost want something next to your name that's like, "Please see me for what I am."
Yeah, definitely. I feel like they should have that kind of maybe training or awareness for. I mean, I don't know what it's like now. Obviously, I've not been at school for a while. You just want to be even just slightly witnessed. Do you know what I mean? Like you just want to be. It has to be just something really subtle. It doesn't have to be a lot. Just like perhaps one day if I was, being a little loudmouth in class, instead of one of them, like perhaps one of the teachers telling me to be quiet or sending me out or make me look like an idiot in front of my classmates, if he just sort of came up to me privately and said, "Look, do you want 5 minutes outside?" That would have been so helpful. Because of course I'm not gonna go out of my way and go up to the teacher and say, "Look, I'm struggling." It's not, the reality of it is that's not what teenagers sort of do. And like you said, I mean, my counsellor at school was lovely as well, but there was a couple of times when he came up to take me out of class and everyone knows who he is, and then after I'd gone and seen him, everyone's asking me about why I was seeing him. I didn't want anyone to think I was different, and sort of kids that kind of age, they don't really understand it.
I don't know how it felt to you, but there was definitely this kind of label around me that was like, "Oh, that's Ben. He's one of the pastoral support kids," kind of thing.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
It's like I don't want to be that. I don't
Yeah.
want that to be how people see me. But there was a few times as well that it got read out in front of the class, and you're like, "Oh my God, please don't tell people that's what I'm doing. Like,
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah.
it's not good. I don't know. Yeah, there's definitely a need for privacy around that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think definitely, especially at that age, that it needs to be a lot more subtle. I think what I struggle with the most is where I was getting treated like a kid. You know, I'd been through something, and so have you, had been through something that a kid shouldn't have been through. So a lot of time, I kind of just wanted to be treated sort of more like an adult kind of thing, because you know, I never saw myself as a 13-year-old when I was 13. I thought that I'd been through, you know, something that, you know, most men don't go through until they're much older. Ben, what was your first perhaps turning point or realization that there might be some grief or trauma there that, I don't know, maybe you started paying some attention to, witnessing?
Yeah, I think the moment for me was one night I was alone in bed, and I had been, it was one of those days that we've been talking about where I'd, been a bit misbehaving, definitely got myself in some trouble at school, that kind of thing. I was like laying there thinking, God, why do I do these things? And sort of analysing myself in that way, and had this real moment, and I never forget it, I don't think, where I was like, the reason I'm doing this is because of this experience of grief. So it was specifically like, in terms of guilt, I felt as though I needed punishing in some way, even though it's completely not my fault, and I accept that now. That's kind of the point that I've got to. But I felt as though it was my fault at the time, in some way. And I felt, therefore, like I needed punishing. And I was deliberately getting myself in trouble so that that punishment would kind of ensue in that
Oh,
way.
wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it was I then understood that and had that real moment of like joining the dots together, and it was just this complete moment of, oh my God, I want this to stop, and to get it to stop I have to disentangle that. I have to look at what I'm doing, analyze it, and then say, here's how I can not do that. I guess that was kind of the first moment that I began to sort of heal in a way, where I felt, oh, I wasn't just ruminating the same feelings. I wasn't just suffering anymore. I was actually able to start building something new in that way. So yeah, I get that would be one sort of thing from the past that's a moment of change in that way. What about yourself?
So I remember being pulled aside by a family member when I was younger, when Dad just had died, and I was told firmly that I was now the man of the house, and I carried that with me throughout my whole, for a long time. You're talking probably about a decade. The whole man stigma was, you don't talk about things, you get on with it. And I thought that meant mainly sort of proving yourself. And when I was 15, I was hanging around with a group of people who, I don't want to say they were a bad group of people at all. I think the thing is I'd attach myself to a group of people who were also struggling. Yeah, one day I went to go meet them after school, and I won't go into it too much, but a kind of an altercation happened. I ran off, and by the time I got home, the police were there to arrest me in front of my mum and sister. And I remember being in the back of that police car, and I felt awful, because I've always had this real thing that I don't ever want people to think that I'm a bad person. And I was just sat there thinking, this isn't me. and sort of why have I done this? And it was that point that I think that was a very key moment in my childhood. I think I'd essentially reached like the eruption. It was like I had all this grief and trauma that had built up and built up and built up, and then I was at that moment where it had finally gone off. It had happened, and to be fair, there was that also little tiny bit of me as well that whilst I was sat there, as much as I felt awful about what I'd done, there was just that slight bit of, I don't know how to word this, but there was that little bit of relief I had in me that I'd finally reached a breaking point. I drifted away from that kind of friendship group, and then I started to reflect a bit on my life choices. I started going to the gym. So after that incident, I did 10 sessions with a counsellor therapist, and it did actually help. And I think the problem was I got to that last session and felt like that was me dealing with the grief and trauma now. And then I sort of then pushed it aside and then thought, right, okay, I've reached that eruption point. I've done a bit of therapy. I'm going to the gym. I feel a bit better now. I mean, everyone's got their own sort of views with how sort of grief works. I don't find that I've ever healed from my grief. I think that what has happened is I've learned to coexist with it. It's kind of just like that. It's a friend that you've never really asked for, I think, grief. And in terms of like, I gave grief some attention when that happened. And then after the therapy, and I thought that was, I'd seen it, I then kind of forgot about it again. And then what happened is the same process started to happen. It started to build up again. And I was getting all the same kind of familiar emotions of, why am I still feeling like it? This had been, it's come up to 10 years now since he died, and I'm still fit. Like I was kind of getting bored of it. I was kind of like, why is this not going away? I think for me personally, it will never go away. But the more I accept it and accept it in my life, the more I can deal with it and even use it to my advantage as well in ways. I think it helps me. Like now, I think I'm definitely more empathetic, and I find it much easier to put myself in any kind of situation, to put myself in someone else's shoes.
Another sort of big revelation, the point that I'm at now, is it's a continual process, and it's something you have to deal with, not just like every now and then. It's an everyday experience. How many of us who haven't lost a parent or someone close to us talk to them every single day or every single week? I mean, I talk to my dad every single day, and if my mum were alive, I would talk to her every day. So the way I see it is the way I deal with grief every day is very similar to that in a way. And that doesn't mean, I spend an hour a day lamenting everything in whatever way it needs to happen. But I kind of, it's a continual experience, and it's not denying it to yourself. It's saying, I do exist with this thing. And like you say, it's a friend you didn't ask for. They're there, and you can either ignore them or you can deal with it. And I'm at a point almost where it's like I'm ready to radically kind of accept it, in that, not that I'm happy about it, not that I'm glad it happened, but that I wouldn't be where I am now. The things that have happened as a result of it, or the things that I'm doing now, are all sort of following on from that long stream of events, and I can be okay with it. It's not being happy about it. It's not being like, yeah, it's the greatest thing in the world, I'm glad my mum died. It's saying to myself, where I am now is okay, and I'm happy with who I am, or happy enough with who I am.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, it does. It really does make sense. I think, and yeah, it does sound a bit crazy to say, but you know, I'm at a point now where I've accepted it, and you know, if there was the option to have my dad back, I'd have him back straight away. But I'm at the point where and this will be hard for people to hear where it's just happened, of course.
Yeah,
But
definitely. It's hard to see this when you're not there.
it
isn't it?
is really hard. But
Yeah.
you know, and it's a long process. You know, this is 13 years on, but you know, I'm at a point where I'm kind of grateful for the situation that I was put in. I'm grateful for all the sort of challenges and things that I've had to deal with, because without it, I kind of dread to think what kind of person I would be now. I think that I'm able to have a different kind of perception of just life and things in general now that I wouldn't have if I hadn't have had to go through all these hurdles and these super low points. And that is the thing, you know, is again, it's just going to be very hard to hear and understand if you've just gone through it. But all these low points and tough times that you go through, it's, you know, I kind of look at them now as, you know, lessons. You know, again, you don't ask for them, but there's always something to take from it. And I think the best thing to sort of realise is, you know, if you come out of it unscathed and a better person, then there's just always something to learn from it. I'm grateful I'm able to sort of sit here now and hopefully help other people.
Yeah, I definitely identify with that. It's a strange thing to say to yourself, and there's still sort of that feeling that tugs at the back of your mind of, is this the right thing to say? That is honestly what I feel. And like you say, for someone who has perhaps lost somebody in the past year, or has kind of just had that moment like I did where it really hit them, you're probably going to feel as though that you're in this kind of despair of nothing will ever feel the same again. It's this irreparable hole that's been lost in your life. And that is genuinely what the experience of grief does feel like, and it still feels like that some days.
Yeah.
But it is a feeling that I think you come to eventually, and it doesn't matter how long it takes to get there, but you do sort of slowly inch ever closer to that, I think.
I definitely agree with that. It's very hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Being in, I call it like a pit of depression, you know, when I find that the more often you're falling into it, the easier it is to climb out each time, I think. And yeah, it just takes time. And I think the important thing to know is there's no time scale and there's no pressure on grief and having to deal and heal with what's going on in your life, because there is no pressure. And from a man's point of view as well, I think that there should just be no embarrassment about talking either. I think it's so important to know that there are other guys out there who will happily listen to you and talk to you, and who are going through similar kind of things. And I think the majority of it, there is that stigma that you've got in your head it's not actually there.
The world that exists today is different in some ways, and
yeah, definitely
there is that perspective as men to be strong about it and to not allow yourself to be weak. But one thing that I've found, and you know, continuously allowed myself to be proven wrong, is that when you open up to someone, they're not going to think less of you.
Yeah, exactly.
My partner, I was really, really scared before we got together that this was going to be something that, you know, once she sees beneath the veil kind of thing, she's going to realise, oh my God, there's so much that's broken about him. He's going to need so much work to fix himself. And then it's the complete opposite. She's actually just, you know, so accepting of it, so willing to be there when I'm hurting, and doesn't judge me for that. So I think as as a man, it's really hard to imagine that that's the reality, but it is completely different in many ways, and people are often so much kinder than I think what we imagine.
Definitely. And I think that whole man of the house thing that I grew up with, my whole viewpoint of that is, I think, to be, that man is to be someone who is, who can be open and talk about their feelings. Because when I try to do the typical man up thing of being quiet, it was actually causing more damage than good. So I think it's very important, and I think that's why this podcast is so important as well, to give that kind of awareness.
It's important to know as well that it doesn't go away. It is something that is still evolving, and that you still sort of
100%.
deal with
Yeah.
so many different ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any sort of experience yourself that you would say is like forthcoming that you're kind of looking to and thinking, I don't know how I'm going to deal with that, or how it's going to potentially have to change again? Your perspectives might be altered, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I don't have I don't have a girlfriend or anything like that. I've always actually found it quite difficult to stay in a relationship, because I would get into these, and I still suffer with this now. This is something that I need to deal with, and I need to, I need to preach what I'm saying. I need to start going to therapy and things like that, because I need to understand it better. Just some things in day to day will bother me a lot more than what they should do. I don't know, it could be something really stupid, like, I don't know, like, say something broke on my car as we were driving back, and it shouldn't wind me up as much as it should. And then it's really hard to explain. Like I said, this is something that I need to actually go and speak to someone about. But relationships are something that that's something I need to work on, I think. And therapy, that's something I need to go to. Yeah, I think that's the biggest kind of thing for me. What kind of things do you think?
I think the biggest kind of outstanding thing for me is I'm a third year student at university, and the kind of big life event that's coming up is graduation. And I went to last year's graduation a couple of weeks ago, because a lot of my friends who were in the year above me were graduating, and I spent some time with them, had some drinks with them, but then realised it's like a really sort of parent-focused event as well. It's like everybody's got mum and dad there, and siblings, and the family's coming to watch this tremendous thing. And I kind of have this feeling in me that I'm going to feel like there's a real missing piece there.
Yeah.
It's really, really strange. And like you're saying, I think it's definitely something that I need to deal with and think through properly, if not seek the help to deal with it properly, because it's it's like I almost feel it as this quite horrible thing that I've got to deal with at some point, but I'm not yet able to grasp it by the horns and say, I'm gonna process you now, and I'm gonna work this one out, how I'm gonna feel about this. So yeah, that's definitely a forthcoming event that I'm really quite scared about, if I'm being honest, because I think another thing is I'm proud of my degree as well. And like we were saying before, I wasn't the best in school. I didn't really see it as a thing of value at the time. This is actually like the first thing in my life that I've been like, oh my God, I've put so much effort into this, and I imagine it's going to end really well, and I want to be really proud of it. And then it's like, oh wait, but there's also this missing factor who's not going to be there to be proud of it. So it feels really, really strange in that way. And I think that's the outstanding kind of thing for me. And then it's all this constant future anticipation of, how do I keep going forward and dealing with new things? Like following graduation is going to be starting a full-time career and then it'll be like, settling down with a partner, who knows where life may lead, but it will be all these things that change and happen, and you kind of think, how is my personal experience of life, which is an altered kind of life in some ways, to what is a more normative experience of losing a parent, which happens to most people in, their 40s, early 50s kind of thing. And it's really, really strange to me that is going to happen, that I've had that experience shaped differently in that way.
Yeah, I can imagine the graduation would be such a big thing, because it's kind of like the end of an era, I suppose. That's the end of like, all that that hardship you had to go through sort of through secondary school and college, sixth form, universities. That's now coming to, that's like the end of it. And I suppose, yeah, that makes it obviously such a big thing and overwhelming to deal with.
Yeah, and it's certainly strange. I think a really nice way to look at it is, it seems big and terrifying and scary, and you sort of imagine, like I've imagined before with other things, that I don't know how to get through this. I don't yet have the tools to do it. But even if you don't have the tools to deal with it, if you don't do the work that you probably should do, then I've got through stuff in the past, and I could probably get through this as well. It's like
100%. Yeah.
I feel like I really have the knowledge that it will be okay, even if it does hurt.
I mean, we're both very young, but yeah, I think any kind of hurdles that I'm faced with now, there is always something in the back of my mind where I'm like, right, okay, I've been through worse, I've been through this, I've been through that. I'll be able to navigate it. I don't really know how I'm going to navigate it, but I'll know there'll be a way, and I'll be okay. And I think one more sort of major sort of forthcoming event maybe that I think is a big thing that plays in my mind is, I suppose, if I ever became a dad, I always have that big fear that that if I died or whatever, then he'd have to go through, or she'd have to go through exactly what I did.
Yeah, that is a thought that really, really scares me in some ways. And I find that one hard. That is a hard thought.
Yeah, it is something that it's only sort of recently actually I've kind of thought about. It's like, there's that kind of little thing of me that doesn't want to be, I feel like I don't want to be selfish, because I just wouldn't ever want to put someone that I care about through that, although it wouldn't be my fault. It was just like, as much as I feel obviously great that I've turned into this kind of person from what's happened, it's tough, and I'd never want to put anything through it. But again, that's something that I have to deal with, and I'll have to navigate at some point.
It's an anticipatory event in my life that I don't know if it will happen yet, but if it does, it will certainly have to be something I think through. And it's also, if I ever had children, it's that feeling that I'd be passing some form of grief onto them in some way, because they'd, children are inquisitive, and they'd turn around and be like, "Where's grandma?"
Yeah, of course.
I don't know yet how to have that conversation with a child. I don't know how you explain something like that in a way that is helpful to them, and also explains things well enough that they understand. So it's the feeling and possibility of children within my life is quite a scary thought, that I think certain grief experiences shape differently, and that's one that's hard to put across to people.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's two sides of it, I suppose. I think there's also that excitement that if I ever did have a kid, it would be nice to have those experiences with my child that I wasn't able to do with my dad. I think I suppose,
Yeah.
a different way of looking at it.
Well, yeah, it's been brilliant. Thank you for chatting about this. It's been incredibly insightful to hear somebody with such a similar experience in many ways. So
Yeah, and like I said, it's been 13 years and I've never sat down with anyone who's a guy my age who's been through something similar. And it's so easy. I think this day and age with all this social media and stuff and this kind of fast-paced world that we live in, this podcast is important, I think, because it shows it doesn't matter how long it's been. It's nice to just take a step back and take time for yourself, reflect on yourself. Yeah, it's been really, really good to speak to you. I think this has been the most valuable conversation I've had in the 13 years of losing my dad. I think if I'd met someone like you with similar issues and a mindset at an earlier age, it would have been brilliant. And I hope this can bring help to other people as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
yeah, the exact same applies to you. I mean, it's weird to say, but I will be leaving with a smile on my face. It's genuinely,
Yeah, so will I. Yeah.
it's so fulfilling to hear somebody feels the way you do. And I hope for anyone who listens to this that even if it's just one line, if it's just something that we've said, it like rings true and they go, oh my God, yeah, I get that. That's kind of my hope in some ways. So
Definitely. Right. Well, thank you very much, Ben.
yeah, and thank you for listening to Grief in Common. For support, resources, or to donate and help us keep creating, visit winstonswish.org. Thank you.